I think the recent controversy and crisis in Syria has really challenged the world community, whatever that means, in some very fundamental ways. Um, First of all, it seems to me that the global community failed Syria in the first instance by not giving support and encouragement to its non-violent movement for democratic change. If the world community had been more sort of attuned to what was happening there, then I think it was highly probable that the Syrian people wouldn't have necessarily lapsed into a civil war, and that Assad might have made some constitutional changes. Now that, of course, was all altered when he started mowing down protesters. But then the kind of question is, how would and should the global community respond? The General Assembly resolution, of course, was utterly in favour of Assad retreating and not shooting on innocent civilians. But then, of course, when it came to doing anything about that in the Security Council, Russia exercised its veto. So the question that kind of challenges us now is, well, how do you change behaviour, and how do you change international attitudes, and how do you prevent odious dictators from continuing to do their evil deeds? And that's the challenge, I think, that's been on the agenda of the global community, the world community, for millennia. So you have two kind of situations at the moment in relation to Syria, two responses to that dilemma in Syria. One, the Chinese and Russian response is to kind of work with the regime to see if they will modify their own behavior, probably by offering some incentives. That didn't seem to work. And the second was the response as epitomized by the Obama administration, which said when the red line had been crossed around the use of chemical weapons, well, all that's left to us now is to exercise some contained force by way of punishment, and also as an incentive to the regime to get its act into order. I think that if that scenario had been allowed to unfold, then it's highly probable we would have been in a major conflict in the Middle East right now. Israel and Lebanon and all the other adjoining states would have been embroiled in a much deeper conflict than there is there at the moment. So the offhand remark by John Kerry to break up the sets of issues that are at the heart of the Syrian crisis and deal with them one at a time, I think is proving to be quite useful. When he said in response to, in this off-the-cuff comment, if Syria can get rid of its chemical weapons, if it can acknowledge it has chemical weapons, and if it can do something to get rid of them, then we can contemplate some negotiations. That was a very interesting invitation to diplomatic solutions rather than military solutions, and that's indeed what's happened in the last week. With Russia's and the Security Council coming up with a resolution that everybody can agree on in relation to Syria joining the Chemical Weapons Convention, opening up its arsenals to international inspection, abolishing the weapons and making sure that they're verifiably abolished. That is progress, and that's something that we need to be thankful for. Now, whether that would have happened without a threat is, of course, now only history can judge. The reality is that if there had been more imagination, a month ago, then possibly that might have been a kind of a soft way into the much more serious negotiations around constitutional change and so forth. But anyway, we've got a good situation at the moment, which is, well, let me start with the bad situation first. The bad situation is that the civil war continues, that people continue to be killed by conventional means, that the opposition movement is not winning this war. Assad looks, unfortunately, to be winning the war. So the war continues, which is bad news, and there remain 4 million people displaced and 100,000 plus and counting killed. The good news is that we have a set of multilateral negotiations around chemical weapons and the Chemical Weapons Convention and the elimination of the Syrian stockpile. and I think a very clear indication that such weapons will not be used in this conflict anymore. So to some extent you can say that's a small gain in terms of international humanitarian law. We've moved away from absolute barbarism to ordinary barbarism. The challenge now is, how do you move beyond that situation to one where we can begin addressing the suffering of literally millions of people that have been displaced now because of the conflict? How do we deal with the traumatic consequences of 100,000 plus deaths and God knows how many injuries? And how do we develop some negotiations around the underlying sources of this conflict in the first place, which is a regime that is very biased, very partial, which marginalizes the majority of the population, where there is no and has not been any kind of democratic accountability or responsibility for the last 100 odd years, and which is run by people who are willing to use ruthless means to maintain their power. And from a non-violent perspective, I guess we don't want to compound the harm that's already being done by extra harm. So we have no alternative but to keep on looking for a negotiated solution. If we don't get a negotiated solution, then all of the next best options seem to me to be an offence against the international rule of law. They challenge our concepts of public morality. They challenge our concepts of of the ways in which we can really get the balance right between national interest and international responsibility. And once again, they challenge our imagination in relation to figuring out how we can deal with evil in ways which don't themselves generate more evil.